All right, welcome everybody. The name of that song was Better Than We Found It. And with that in mind, I'm so happy to have as our inaugural speaker for the NYPAN speaker series, Warren Mosler, who I'm convinced that after this presentation, you're going to realize that we can make America a better place for all of us. Basic rules are going to be, the first half of this presentation is just going to be questions and answers that I'm going to be asking Warren. But in the meantime, if anything sparks your creative juices, put your questions in the chat. And I may break from protocol from time to time to take a question from there. But the whole second half of this program is geared towards this audience that's here. So you're going to be able to ask questions directly to Mr. Mosler. So I'm going to just start off by asking Mr. Mosler to look at America today through an economic lens, to tell us what you think about what's going on today. And we're going to just segue into what MNT is after that. Thank you for coming and joining us here.
Okay, so currently we have a lot of people out of work. We're probably down 15 million people from where we might otherwise be. And all real output comes from doing work. And so we're, the lost output during the last year, the lost real output during the last year is probably something in the order of magnitude of all the real losses of all the wars in history. So we're like, we're bleeding right now in that sense, and not anywhere near meeting our potential as a society. Okay, and another thing happened in the last year, and that is immediately after COVID, what I would call the environmental degradation, pollution levels, et cetera, they dropped something like 50% immediately, and all on non-essentials. Okay, so we gave up non-essentials, and our emissions, harmful emissions, problematic emissions dropped 50%. Now that's more than we could have dropped by all the Green New Deals anyone ever dreamed up for the next 50 years and all the trillions of dollars it's supposed to have cost. And it just happened, okay, through conservation. Now, I've been talking about conservation before that, saying we could cut our emissions in half, but I had no idea it was actually going to happen. And so, and it was done by eliminating non-essentials. So if these things are non-essential, and now we're bringing them all back, and we're back to about 90% of where we were before in terms of environmental degradation, the rate of degrading the environment. What's going on here? You talk about squandering an opportunity. Okay, we brought back non-essentials to reverse all the progress we made, and now to make that progress again without a COVID shock is just going to be like enormously costly, in real terms, and that's just so disappointing to see that opportunity slip by. So anyway, I had to sneak that in.
Yeah. Warren, we're going to take a question from the chat here. Yeah. Michael Graves is saying, what do you mean by non-essentials?
Yeah, well, there was plenty of food. There were no shortages of anything except handy wipes or something like that on a temporary basis. And none of the, in that sense, it was considered a drop in non-essentials. Any essential services were kept going, essential to sustain life. It's essential to move on. Now, I know there's like disagreements over what's essential and what's not, but the things that we stopped doing, I'm saying can be brought back. Right? We could have made an effort to bring them back, or to bring things back. We didn't have to bring back the exact same things, but bring everything back in a way that didn't contribute to environmental degradation from where we were.
So I know in my own world, I'm a school teacher.
Yeah.
Last March, we got the order that we're going to be doing all our education from the home.
Yeah.
And just logically there, in terms of the traffic that normally would appear on the Long Island Expressway,
yes,
teachers going to and fro work,
yes,
that all disappeared. That was gone.
Yes. Yeah.
And I did notice that, it just seemed for that window of time, how wonderful life was, in terms of the environment.
Right.
So you're suggesting that maybe that's a lost opportunity or something we could be thinking about in terms of maybe rethinking the world of work?
Yeah, and miles driven dropped by, I don't know, 30 or 40% initially, maybe more. And now the idea is, okay, the economy's doing better now. People are driving. It's back to 90%. Good job, America. And we're back to number one in the world in miles driven or something. And all our yardsticks are just we have a chance to start remeasuring how well we're doing. We could have been downloading more software, doing something that doesn't degrade the environment, or having more live performances in neighborhoods where we didn't have to drive to, or I don't know. It's just, there wasn't any effort at all made to recognize what had happened, any effort to continue doing it. To people a lot smarter than I am who could have come up with ways to bring back what's important to our lives that we could accomplish without degrading the environment. And we have so much of our output now has a zero marginal cost. All the things we download, and zero environmental impact. And these are the areas that we can grow in indefinitely. It's not the end of growth, it's the end of destructive growth that we have to look at. And it wasn't even considered at all. All the metrics that we're judging by are the same ones that got us to where we were to begin with. So anyway, we're a little away from MMT, but
that's okay.
I'll keep coming back.
We are going to come back to that.
Yeah.
Let's just start off with the basics of what is MMT.
Yes.
And how did you come to MMT yourself?
So I've been, I used to be a fund manager. From 1982 to 1997, I ran an investment company. We had the #1 risk-adjusted returns in the world. We didn't have a losing trade for all 15 years. It was all fixed income, interest rate type of things, derivatives. I was the guy who invented a lot of those derivatives of the 1980s, working with dealers like Salomon Brothers and Goldman Sachs. I started off on the trading desk, sales desk at Bankers Trust. We were a primary dealer at the time. So that's where I got my education.
Derivatives aren't necessarily a good thing. Having just shown my students the movie The Big Short.
Yeah.
And all the crazy that was going on.
Yeah, but if you go to buy a house, to buy corn futures because you have a food company and you need to lock in the price of your corn for the next couple of years, that's not a bad thing. That's a derivative. So anything that represents something else is a derivative. But we used to, embed derivatives into agency paper. So you'd have a Fannie Mae or Freddie Mae security, and we put in all kinds of performance clauses in those to tailor what people wanted to fit their investment portfolios, which is it's a complete waste of human endeavor, the whole thing. But being in the middle of that made it very obvious to me that pretty much the entire financial sector, apart from maybe a payment system, is a complete waste of human endeavor, and it's entirely parasitic.
So what brought you away from that and to this world of MMT?
Yeah, so in 1992, there was a situation in Italy where Italian bonds were very inexpensive because everybody thought that government would default. And if you could come up with a reason they wouldn't default, then there was a lot of opportunity there to make returns for your investors. And that's when I came up with what I'm going to tell you next about MMT. And so I wouldn't have thought about it if it wasn't for that situation. It just was a situation that directed my thought in that direction. Once I understood it, and then I saw what was going on with the political debates in the US, I became committed to getting that knowledge out there, with the understanding that it's a very simple piece of knowledge can make an enormous difference. And it's been 30 years. And so there's two possibilities. It's a lot more difficult to get this knowledge into the world and have it serve public purpose.
What is that knowledge? What did you learn?
Okay, so the knowledge is that every congressman, every member of parliament thinks that they need to get money by taxing to be able to spend. I got to get the money if I want to spend. So I tax it to spend. And when I don't tax, if I want to spend more than what I get in taxing, I have to go borrow it somewhere to be able to spend it. So President Obama took a trip to China with Hillary Clinton and somebody else to talk to our bankers to make sure that we could borrow the money for healthcare. So it was clearly the mindset that there was this imperative to get the money in to be able to spend it. And when I first started, it was Ross Perot who was coming on about the deficit and the debt and how we were going bankrupt and the children, the next generation. So anyway, so that's what every member of Congress believed. And it turned out that it's completely backwards, that the money, the dollars to pay taxes, the dollars to buy government bonds, they all come from the government and its agents. Today, the Federal Reserve is an agent of the government. It uses the Federal Reserve as its public bank to process all its transactions. But it's an agent of the government and it operates as under the Federal Reserve Act of Congress to do Congress's congressional will. Anyway, so the fact is that all the dollars to pay taxes, all the dollars to buy bonds come from the Federal Reserve. They come from the US government, which means the US government is actually spending first, crediting accounts. And then those are the dollars that can then be used to pay taxes or can then be used to buy government bonds. Okay, so it's the economy that needs the government's money to pay its taxes and to buy government bonds. It's not that the government needs our money to spend. Okay, they've got it completely backwards. I call it sequence. So the most important takeaway you can get from MMT is sequence. And everyone, I'd go regularly visit people at the Fed and discuss monetary policy. And they all know this. All the senior staff, they say it another way. They say you can't do a reserve drain without a prior reserve add. That means they have to reserve add means they buy something. They buy securities, pay for them, which adds dollars to the banking system. Then the banking system has the money to buy government bonds or to pay taxes. And money and dollars can be transferred to the Treasury. But you can't transfer dollars out of an account that's empty. So the Fed's job is what's called offsetting operating factors, where they make sure they're spending first so the dollars are there to be paid to the government. And spending can take the form of lending. Lending is actually a subset of spending. You're just buying the other person's promissory note. So without getting too technical, it's all the same thing. It's all crediting accounts at the member bank accounts at the Fed. Okay, so that was 1992, that important takeaway. So now, once you see the government spends first and then the dollars are there to pay taxes, the whole imperative changes. Okay, how can you be like crowding anybody out? Or how can borrowing be using up dollars that could be doing something else? They're the dollars you just spent. And then these people voluntarily use those dollars you just added to buy government bonds. And if you're spending first, how can there be a solvency problem? They say, the question of where's the money coming from? It's not applicable. You're just crediting accounts. And you have to credit them first before you can debit them. It's a simple fact of accounting. Even if you allow banks to run, clients to run overdrafts, an overdraft is a loan from the bank. An overdraft, so you're lending first, either directly, proactively, or through an overdraft. It's all the same thing for accounting purposes. Okay, so once you understand that, the entire solvency issue goes away. You're no longer worried about the government bouncing checks, or what if China doesn't buy our debt? That's like, well, what if we spend money and we credit their account, and they just leave it in that account and don't move it to another account called the debt, Treasury securities. They're just a savings account at the Fed. Nothing happens. We've already spent the money. If they don't buy the debt, they don't buy the debt. It doesn't mean we can't spend the money. They don't even have that decision until after we spent the money. And the debt is something we offer after the fact, not something we offer ahead of time to get the money to spend. Now, that was 30 years ago. And today I see President Biden is talking about, getting in $2 trillion through corporate tax to pay for infrastructure. He's still got it backwards. Now, fortunately, a lot of people don't have it backwards anymore. MMT is everywhere. And Congress passed the last two spending bills, large ones, trillions, without even a consideration of the idea that you have to get the money first somehow or you can't spend it. They just appropriated the money and it gets spent. And then that money that was spent is used to either pay taxes or
So we've been using MMT principles for a long time.
Well, MMT is Stephanie Kelton, who's excellent proponent, calls it a lens. And I'm not sure she was the first one to do that, but it's a way of looking at something everybody's been looking at it, but you see it differently, and they've just had this sequence backwards. And it's been backwards for a long, long time. Now, maybe it started on the gold standard where you you could not spend first. You have to get the gold in, or you weren't allowed to issue gold certificates. But that all ended on a practical level in 1934 and on a technical level in 1971. So that, whether that's the reason or not is really no consequence. They've just got it backwards, and it's wrong, and it's been crippling the progressive agenda, which is why I'm concerned about it. As a progressive economist, I see this as an obstacle to the progressive agenda. And when I see headline left economists and congressmen still in this paradigm, it's very disconcerting. So what's happened is the headline left has become the enemy of the progressive agenda. Now, the right, you expect them to be the problem, but when the left is sort of implicitly on their side, agreeing that we have to get dollars first to be able to spend, it's hard enough to get this stuff through without our friends working against us.
So why is that? Why is the left not getting this?
I don't know. I had meetings several years ago with Bernie Sanders' staff and Bernie, and he was only there for 15 minutes after I spoke with the staff. The staff got it. They had my book from 2010. I was there with one of my partners, and we had a good, solid discussion. And then Bernie comes in and he goes, well, I'm a fiscal conservative and I'm not going to change now. I've been a fiscal conservative all my life and I'm not going to change now. And, we need to tax the rich to get their money. And I'm not, he probably thought I was trying to trick him out of taxing the rich or something like that. I don't know, but he just wasn't there. And I've yet to see anything out of him that indicates that that's his understanding. And I 100% support all his proposals in terms of Medicare for all, for example. But why don't we have Medicare for all? And I'll blame Bernie Sanders because he's the one who said we need a $2 trillion tax to pay for it. So Hillary Clinton points to the tax and says, see, we can't afford this. And then we've got to work with what we have. And Bernie loses and she wins in primary and it's gone. And just time after time, I've seen it lose on this premise that we need a $2 trillion tax to pay for it. When you look at Medicare for all carefully, it's a deflationary event. You would never increase taxes.
I kind of want to stop you for a second and just talk about what is the role of taxes and what should we be doing in trying to sell with the Medicare for all?
Right. So the point, to sell Medicare for all, we have to do exactly what Stephanie says. Look at it as to whether it causes unemployment, it causes inflation or not. And if you look at it, 5 million people lose their jobs out of private sector insurance companies, which is a good thing. Those were worthless endeavors, waste of human endeavor. And it's a deflationary event because prices come down everywhere. Businesses, costs are cut, and they're competitive. They're going to lower prices. Not all business. And so when you've got a unemployment going up and CPI prices flat to going down, you don't raise taxes. You look at the economy, if anything, you would cut taxes or add public services. You'd pay for Medicare for all by forgiving student debt or having free public education. That's how you pay for it, not by raising taxes. So I answered the second part of your question first. Get me back to the first part.
Well, in terms of the role of taxes,
so what is the role of taxes? So we have to look at what the money story is for a government like the US. And most economics textbooks tell a money story about people were bartering and then started using money or something, but that's not relevant to today. Today's money story goes like this. You have a state, a government that wants to provision itself. It wants public health workers. It wants a military. It wants education, public education. It wants all these things. And so how does it get people out of the private sector into the public sector? How does it provision itself? And so the first thing it does, now it can come up with a currency like the US dollar, but nobody knows what it is or cares what it is. And so the first thing you have to do, and the first thing they do, is they impose tax liabilities. They impose tax requirements. So just think about a head tax. Everybody has to pay a tax. Or think about a real estate tax. We won't talk about the complicated taxes. Now they work, but it's more complicated. So think about just a real estate tax. Everybody's got a tax on their house where they live. If you rent, the landlord has a tax that he passes through. So there's a tax on everybody's dwelling, and it's payable in dollars. Well, now we've created an economy where everybody needs dollars to pay this tax. And that's the purpose of taxation. They are now sellers of their labor. They're looking for jobs that pay in dollars. They're sellers of goods and services. The farmer wants to sell tomatoes because he doesn't want to serve in the army to get money to pay his tax. And we have monetized the economy. We've created sellers of goods and services so the government can now provision itself by what it has caused to be offered for sale by spending its otherwise worthless currency. Okay, so the sequence is the government wants to provision itself. Then let me shut this off. I don't know how to shut these notifications off my computer. Okay, the government wants to provision itself, number one. So number two, it levies a tax liability, doesn't collect the tax, puts a tax requirement in place. That creates sellers of goods and services. Now, a person trying to sell their labor to get dollars, we call that person unemployed. Unemployment is people looking for paid work. It's not people looking to volunteer at the American Cancer Society, people looking for paid work. And that's a byproduct of the creation of tax liabilities by design. Tax liabilities, in the first instance, create unemployment, people looking for paid work, because the economy needs that money to pay the tax. Everybody needs dollars for one thing or another. Okay, so the government creates unemployment, and then it hires the people it caused to be unemployed to serve in the government. Okay, it then pays them, and then they pay the tax. And that ends the cycle. So the cycle ends when the government gets the money. It doesn't start there. All right, and so so the question is, the government's tax liabilities have created right now, 15 million more unemployed than the government wants to hire. Well, what's the point of that? All right, so either we have to hire them because they're there because we created it, or else lower the tax and they'll go away. The only reason they're unemployed is because of the tax. Now, as a progressive economist, I've got a lot of things we can do hiring these people right now. We have all this, what's called fiscal space, people who are willing to work who can't find a job and will work for the government's money. So there's lots of room to hire these people to get done the things we want to do. Some, conservative might prefer lowering taxes and let the private sector try and do it. I can give you a lot of reasons why I don't think that'll work, but it would be the type of thing that you would conclude is the thing to do next once you understand the monetary system. Okay, so it's the purpose again of taxation. There's tax liabilities, which create unemployment to provision government, and then there's a tax payment. The purpose of the tax payment itself is just to keep people honest. If you tell people, look, you can just throw the money away, put it down to disposal, it would work. But to keep them honest, they have to pay it. We can't trust them to just throw it away.
So I want to get back to MMT. So MMT seems to suggest that we don't have to rely on taxes.
No, we have to rely on tax liabilities to create sellers.
But because the government is the issuer of currency, we can never run out of money.
Right.
So what is preventing us from then going big, other than the man-made restrictions that politicians have put on the process?
Okay, so what's preventing us? What's making it possible? Let's look at it from the positive side. Is what is offered for sale. Can we hire people now to work in the Green New Deal or whatever we want to do, public health? And you can look at the employment numbers and see if there are people willing to work. Now, if there aren't, if unemployment is very low and you want to hire 20 million people for government, you're going to drive up prices hiring. You're going to have to outbid the private sector, and you will cause inflation by having the government pay more for the same thing. If they're available for sale at current prices, then you can just buy them and you don't have an inflation problem. If you need to buy steel or glass or whatever for the government, food, look at what's for sale at current prices, estimate how much you can buy at current prices without driving up price. And that will tell you, what you can get. Now, it might be good policy to drive up price a little bit. I'm not saying it's not. I'm just answering your question as to what do you look at to decide what you can afford? You look at what's offered for sale.
So if we were looking at our current situation right now, we have millions of people unemployed.
Yes.
This looks like it's the right economy right now for a guaranteed job. Where do you stand on a guaranteed job as a goal of MMT?
Okay, so we look at the tax. It's created 15 million more unemployed than the government wanted to hire, or at this moment has chosen to hire. That's to me, that's a crime against humanity. We made a mistake. Why would anybody do that? Okay, let me just give you a quick example. The British went into Africa to grow coffee, and nobody there wanted to work in a coffee plantation. So they put a tax on everybody's huts, they called them. It was a hut tax. And they came up with a script called Crown or something like that. You have to pay 100 crown a month, otherwise the military would burn your house down. And how could they earn crown? They could go down to the coffee plantation and earn the crown. Well, they went down to the coffee plantation. Same thing, the tax created unemployment. They showed up looking for work. They hired them to grow coffee, and then they were able to pay the tax, and they didn't get their house burned down. Now, they gave everyone a job who needed one to prevent getting their house burned down. If they didn't need all those people, they didn't say, sorry, we're going to burn your house down. That didn't serve British policy. They either lowered the tax or they gave them some kind of job to do in the meantime and then reevaluated their tax policy. Okay, we just put a tax on everybody's house, just figuratively. 15 million people can't get work and they're losing their houses. And we say, it's too bad. We don't want to hire you. We created this unemployment with this requirement for money that you don't have, the economy doesn't have. The money to pay the tax comes from me, the government, and I'm not going to let you have it. I'm going to burn your house down. Ha ha. This is where we are now. I mean, this is inexcusable. So we have to make a decision here. We either have to hire those people to be doing government jobs or get them back in the private sector that we, quote, took them away from, figuratively. Okay, the tax pulled them out of the private sector. They are in the public sector. They would not be unemployed as they are without the public sector's tax liability that pulled them out of the private sector. All non-monetized economies that don't use money, none of them have an unemployment issue at all. It's never been found in any, America before the Europeans got here. The Indians didn't have monetary system. There's no unemployment. Africa never had unemployment. Asia never had unemployment. This is a monetary phenomenon caused by tax.
So I want to get back to the need for a guaranteed job.
So I'm right there. Okay. So if we decide we want them in the public sector, we just hire them all. We don't need a guaranteed job. We just hire anybody looking for a job. We put them in different public sector jobs. If we decide we don't want them in the public sector, we don't just leave them as unemployed the way we do today and let them try and get back into the private sector because they're damaged goods. Once you become unemployed due to tax liabilities, the private sector doesn't want to hire you. You're too much of a risk. You might be on drugs. You might not take a bath every day. You might get in fights. It's risky hiring the unemployed. And the longer they've been unemployed, the worse it is. We get this awful hysteresis of unemployment going on where the number over time of long-term unemployed is just criminal. So how do you get them back into the private sector? You offer them all a job. Anybody willing and able to work and have a public sector can have a job funded by the government. And once they're working in that job, now they become eligible for, in the eyes of private sector employers, and they will hire them into the private sector. So the purpose of the job guarantee, I call it the transition job, is to promote the transition from unemployment to private sector work for those people we don't want full-time in the public sector. If we want them full-time in the public sector, hire them a normal public pay school. That's the progressive pay scales. That's the progressive agenda. Pay public sector workers properly. We have whole pay scales for them. We don't want to start provisioning the public sector with $15 an hour people, and they'll say, oh, we're not replacing any public sector jobs. Sure you are. Those people could have been in their same public sector jobs at long, hard fought for public sector, terms and conditions of employment, not under job guarantee terms. So I don't want to open up that can of worms where we start undermining the public sector pay schedule by the idea of using the transition job, the job guarantee, to provision the public sector. That should not be its primary concern. Otherwise, we get into that ugly situation, and it's disruptive, and I think it's wrong, and I think it's immoral. And so I see it as doing what it actually does very well. It transitions people who the public sector doesn't want to hire back into the private sector. Now they could still be hired by the public sector.
Why aren't we doing this now?
I'll give them the benefit of the doubt. I use the word innocent fraud in my book, but I'll say they don't know any better, rather than they're malicious. But, there's no reason not to give them the benefit of the doubt right now. I'm not a grand jury.
I had heard that you actually helped influence a guaranteed job for the Argentinian people a decade or so ago. Can you talk about that?
Yeah. So in 2001, the peso blew up with like 32 dead in the street in Buenos Aires, and they floated the peso. And Daniel Kozar was in the labor ministry 2 or 3 years before. He'd gone to UNKC. to read up on what was called, we call it the job guarantee. I wrote the paper, Full Employment and Price Stability in 1996 or 7. And he read that. It was published in the Post-Keynesian Journal of Economics by Paul Davidson. And he was on top of that. He had it inside out, offering everybody a job thing. And as soon as it blew up in Argentina and the peso floated, he got that program through. They offered a job that it was not anyone willing to work, but it was every head of household. It's called the JEFES program, JEFES, and Jefes de Hogar. And over the next couple of years, they got 2 million people into that program who no one ever thought would ever work. That's on a population of like 33 or 35 million back then. It was a vast number of people. And a lot of them were disadvantaged people like Indians, and they have a very strict class system down there. And these were people at the bottom of their class structure, and had never had private sector jobs, never expected to. After 2 years, 1 million of those people were hired by the private sector, and they had the strongest economy in the world in terms of employment gains, GDP growth, and everything else. And it was these people, it was transitioning from the job guarantee, the transition job, into the private sector. The public sector did not want to hire them. Okay, so would I have suggested the public sector hire them rightly as normal employees? Sure, but they weren't going to do that. But we know that they transitioned. Now, when you talk to other people and they tell you the success of this program, they say, oh, well, they built lots of infrastructure projects. They built sewage treatment, drainage system for this village. And they worked in soup kitchens and helped with daycare projects. And that's all true. There was a lot of very good, useful output. And I'm not downplaying that at all. But I would say, look, the government should have hired those people to do those projects. They didn't need a job guarantee for that. But they had one, and they saw that these projects could be done. So now they should just hire those people into that project. But at the same time, they didn't want all 2 million doing that. 1 million transitioned into Buenos Aires insurance companies to work in their cafeteria, who've been working in the soup kitchen in the project because they came into work, they were friendly, they got along, they were recommended by a supervisor, they were safe to hire. So it was enormously successful. I judge the success first by the transition to the private sector, second by the projects that were done, only because that just showed that they should have been hiring those people anyway to do those projects.
Got a question here from Susan. She says,
Yeah.
Congress can authorize the spending for whatever it wants,
Yes,
whenever it wants.
yes,
They are not dependent on tax revenue or bond insurance issuance.
yes.
So why are they not doing it? Why do progressive politicians got more?
If it was me,
yeah.
If it was me and
we're limiting what we do.
Yeah, if it was me and there was a bill introduced to spend $10 trillion to buy something, I would look to see if those things were offered for sale, or if we're just going to run the prices up and just be spinning our wheels. Because you can only buy what's offered for sale. If it's not offered for sale, you're just going to bid up the price and take it away from somebody else. And it has to be pretty important to do that. And so the informed congressional representative would say no for that reason. The uninformed would say no because they think the day of reckoning is coming. We have debt to repay China or some nonsense like that. So I can't tell you who's informed and who's not informed at this time. I can tell you who I've spoken to who knows better. And, so but does that answer your question?
Susan,
Yes.
feel free to.
Yes.
Feel
I think
free to
it
respond.
does. I guess one other thing that I wanted to know as well is with the corporate tax, and I know Warren is pushing that, and Bernie, and there are other progressive politicians.
Yeah.
Corporate tax. And so my response would be, well, okay, that money can't really actually be used to fund anything at the federal level. If we do it at the federal level, at the state level, it can probably at the
Yes.
local level, but not at the federal level. So I'm wondering if their motive is to use that as a way to reduce wealth inequality. And if so, is that a good way to reduce wealth inequality, like from the Jeff Bezos and the Mark Zuckerbergs of the world? Or is there another thing that we need to do that would reduce wealth inequality? And would it be through a tax, or would it be through a combination of other things?
Yeah, right. Okay. So there's two-part questions. I got to remember the first part. The corporate, let me just start off by what hits me between the eyes. is a corporate tax is highly regressive. Corporation is just a piece of paper. If you put a tax on, potato chips, the price of potato chip companies, the price of potato chips goes up to pay for it. All the money that corporations get comes from the consumer. So if it's something like potato chips, it's a very regressive tax that you're putting on. And the majority of corporate taxes would be highly, highly regressive. So I would not, if you're going to put a tax on a corporation that builds yachts for the super rich or something, that would be different. But I would just regulate those out of existence. I don't think it's worth cutting down the rainforest for teak deck on somebody's 500-foot yacht, but that's just me. But I would just regulate that out of existence rather than try and do it through the corporate tax somehow. So you have to look at what it is now for the state and local governments. Yes, the corporate tax is needed by them for accounting purposes to buy things, but it's much easier for the federal government just to make a per capita, let's say, distribution to all the state and local governments without bothering with the corporate tax. And then it would accomplish the same thing for the state and local governments. They don't really care how their account gets credited as long as it gets credited. So you got a highly regressive tax, which I'm just sort of categorically against. You'd have to give me a special situation to tell me I'm wrong. And they're doing it out of, I think it's a narrative that has gotten them support, and maybe they really believe it. I don't know. But, and do I have ways to address this distribution of consumption, distribution of income in the economy? Yeah, absolutely. And I have ways that I think work very effectively at source. And I like to say, in any case, the corporate tax, it won't work if it worked, but it doesn't work. Just history has shown us that it doesn't do anything to address the issue they want to address. Let me add one more thing to give you an example of. So Elizabeth Warren introduced a wealth tax, or floated the idea of a wealth tax. And let's say it's 1% of everybody's bank deposits. Let me just click on this thing. That means if you have $100 in the bank, a year later you have 99. And that is a tax, and it's recognized as something that presumably to reduce aggregate demand, slow down the economy. Now let's look at the Federal Reserve, who's been looking at the possibility of doing what the European Central Bank has done, which is a negative interest rate. Okay, so let's say they went to a -1% interest rate. They would do that with the idea of stimulating the economy, increasing aggregate demand, trying to get unemployment lower and inflation up to support the economy. Yet, if I had $100 in the bank with a 1% negative income tax, at the end of the year, I'd have $99. Exactly the same outcome as Elizabeth Warren's wealth tax. It's like, what's the difference? They're both the same. Okay, they're both a tax. A negative interest rate is a tax that does exactly what Elizabeth Warren's wealth tax is, except it has the appearance of being some stimulative measure by the Federal Reserve. So, would she be happy if the Fed went to a -1% interest rate, a negative interest rate, because that would accomplish what she wanted on her wealth tax, or 2%? I don't know. But has she even considered that it's the same thing, and to maybe rethink, the whole process of how we're framing and introducing these types of things? So anyway, I just thought I'd throw that in.
Okay, Warren, I'm going to start to take some questions from guests here, and then I'm going to come back with some more questions for you for myself.
Okay.
Michael's got his hand up there.
Sure, and thank you. Is my mic level is all right? Y'all can hear me?
Yeah, nice and loud.
Yes.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you. So I'm really happy that you're drawing some from at least some anthropological examples as far as supporting the way that you are constructing an idea of value, or at least, of course, that we've got a monetary system, right? Chartalism is what it's called, from what I understand. So it's the idea of the origin of money. And so part of the concern here is that one is able to have a federal government that is able to create money because it's requiring people to be drawn into tax liabilities, right? So creating these taxes is in fact what draws people into an economic system. It draws them into the state, broadly speaking.
Yes, and let me add, the money, that the dollar is a tax credit, is the
right.
tax credit. Yeah.
Okay, I thank you. And so there's a lot of really good literature coming out of South America, in fact, that you bring up Argentina as an example. Actually, in Peru, there's a lot of really good literature that describes precisely that, levying taxes upon Indian populations in order to draw them into the state, thereby bring them into labor regimes. Yes. And similarly, I actually lived in Argentina shortly after the period that you were involved there. So after 2008 or so, I was living there, and have seen some things in regards to the way the economy kind of played out and is playing out presently. More to my point is actually the question of debt. So in modern monetary theory, the concern is less about the notion of debt or even that this debt is going to be called in, because one can always generate the resources necessary to continue the spending needed to keep the state furnished, or at least provisioned is the word that you would use. And so I'm interested about your bringing up the sort of European strategy, if you will, about negative interest rates, but more importantly, why not debt abrogation or crushing debt down? And I say this specifically because of David Graeber. Dr. David Graeber wrote a book called Debt, which you may or may not be familiar with, but if you aren't, is really well worth looking at in light of monetary theory, because he really looks at the idea of debt maybe not, if actually being the principle upon which value is derived. That is to say, so long as somebody is asking something of you, you now have to oblige them. And so on the other side of the coin, I thank you for your patience. The other side of the coin then is, if we have debts that are outstanding, could we not have a jubilee, so to speak, crushing a certain measure of national debt? Or alternatively, if we have black swan events in which there is in fact a large disbursement of money to the general populace, rather unlocking money otherwise locked up in the banks and then brought to people. Are those not legitimate strategies to address similar concerns?
Okay, so once you understand the debits and credits of the monetary system, those questions, they all change. So first of all, you're talking about public debt. What is the public debt? Okay, so it's the dollars spent by the U.S. government, tax credits. They spend first, right? Mm-hmm. That some gets used to pay taxes, and the rest remains outstanding as the public debt. Right. Okay, and it gets shifted from checking accounts at the Fed to savings accounts, from reserves to securities. But those are just the dollars spent by the government that haven't yet been used to pay taxes.
Right.
So and they're the money, and they're the net money supply in the economy. They're dollars in bank accounts at the Federal Reserve Bank called Treasury securities. It's just a savings account. You give them money, you get it back with interest. So how do you pay back the money? It already is the money. Well, what happens when a Treasury security matures? The Fed debits your securities account and credits your reserve account. They shift the money from your savings account back to your checking account. That's what happens when it matures. If you want to buy more debt, they'll shift the money from checking back to savings. So, it's like, how does Bank of America pay off their savings accounts? Well, they take it out of your savings and put it in your checking. And if they were the only bank in the system, it would have nowhere else to go. And so if you look at the Federal Reserve, the dollars at the Federal Reserve can only go from one account to another. They can't go anywhere else. It's inside money. And the government spends by crediting an account. That account then has a balance. Those are the dollars the government spent that haven't been used to pay taxes. That's the public debt. They haven't been used to pay taxes. It's very simple. And if you move them to another account called the Treasury security, called the savings account, okay, it's still an account at the Federal Reserve. So there's nothing to pay back. And that becomes the net money supply in the economy. That are the net financial assets in the economy to the penny. When the CBO determines net financial assets, that's what they look at. Okay, and so a growing economy has a growing money supply. Our economy has $26 trillion of net financial assets that we call Treasury securities that are the equity behind our entire credit structure, private credit structure. Okay, now, if you're talking about private sector credit, that's a different animal. So sure. I'll give you the benefit of the doubt and say you were talking about private sector credit.
To a large extent, yes.
Yeah, so the idea of the federal government paying off its debt is not an applicable question with today's policy, floating exchange rate, that type of thing. It's just the only thing that they will give you for a $10 bill is 2 5s. You can't get any gold or anything like that, right? The government, the Fed, they'll just make change. These are just tax credits, and they're all just tax credits. So there's nothing to pay off. Now, Private sector debt is a different story. State debt, whatever, is a different story. That is something that does need to be repaid. That is your marker that needs to be repaid with U.S. government tax credits. And we already have Jubilee with that. It's called bankruptcy. The bankruptcy laws are today's Jubilee laws. And we can do anything we want with the bankruptcy laws. We can say anybody can go bankrupt and never have to pay anything back. Now, every 10 years, you're allowed to go bankrupt. Every 20 years, you're not allowed to securitize your house with a mortgage. We can come up with any bankruptcy laws we want, and those will have consequences in terms of your ability to get credit, which might be okay. So the only reason you can borrow money privately is because the government will enforce, the payback of that money. If we don't enforce, if there are no laws on requiring anyone to pay back their money, if you don't pay the bank and they have no recourse, then you have your Jubilee and probably won't get a loan to begin with. So, and I'm oversimplifying a little bit, but we do have complete Jubilee, and it's all in the bankruptcy code. And that is subject to legislative change.
All right, I want to move on to the next question here. Robert, you've had your hand up there for a while.
Yes. I have a question concerning the auction situation of bonds in the Fed or in the Treasury and how that connects up. I'm still a little bit confused on that.
Okay, so we have a policy that says the Treasury is not allowed to have a negative balance in its account at the Fed. It happens from time to time and gets covered, but it's the general policy. I call that a self-imposed constraint. It's not inherent in monetary operations. We've decided to put that in. It's like if you take your shoes and you tie the shoelaces to each other, and now you can't walk very well, you can just shuffle. And you say, yeah, human beings have problems walking. Well, yeah, they just tied their shoelaces to you. Okay, so yes, that's there. So we have the self-imposed constraints. So the Treasury has to go out and sell securities to have a balance in its Fed account. Now, it's first before it can spend. But the private sector doesn't have any dollars to pay for those securities. So how do we solve this? The Treasury lends the dollars to the private sector to buy the Fed lends the dollars to the private sector or gives them an open line of credit to be able to buy Treasury securities, which the Fed will then lend them the money to pay for it. And then those dollars can then go into the account of the Treasury, and now the Treasury can spend. So it's kind of a whoop-de-doo little game they play. It's called, the setup is called the primary dealer setup. There used to be 40. Now I think there's 20-something primary dealers. And they all have lines of credit to the Fed. They can buy all the Treasury securities they want. The Treasury securities are sold at auction, and the primary dealers have to participate or they will lose their status as primary dealers. So I was a primary dealer. I mean, Bankers Trust was a primary dealer when I worked there. And we would lose money year in and year out. Not a lot, a little bit on this primary. And I saw that on the statement. I go to the trading manager. Why are we a primary dealer? The Treasury has the game rigged, so we're all losing money. He says, well, we have to, because if we're not a primary dealer, then the large accounts like state of California, state of New York won't do business with us. So in order to keep our clientele, we've got to contribute to this thing called the primary dealer arrangement. Now, I'm not sure they're still losing money today, but they probably are, because I think Treasury kind of likes it that way. It gets them off the hook for saying, we're not paying anybody to do this for us. And the primary dealers are okay because they're making enough money on their other clients to make it worth their while. But back then, several of the smaller primary dealers dropped out because they didn't see the value of losing money on this arrangement. So anyway, it comes down to the fact that the Treasury can sell an infinite amount of short-term bills anytime it wants to flood its account with dollars. There's no restriction.
All right.
Okay, now you have the interest rate is coupled to that, is it not?
No. Well, the Fed sets a policy rate. It could couple it, but it sets an overnight rate, which it enforces. Look, the overnight rate will be zero. Balances at the Fed will not earn interest unless the Fed pays interest on those balances. They can't go anywhere. So now it's paying interest on reserves, which is interest on balances, and Treasury securities are interest on balances in securities accounts, in the savings accounts. So in the absence of the Fed, the Treasury paying interest on the dollars on deposit there, the rate would be zero. So what they do is these policies are there to support interest rates just at the Fed's policy rate. So if the Fed's policy rate is zero, it doesn't have to do anything. It doesn't have to pay interest on reserves, and the Treasury doesn't have to sell securities. Now, because we have this self-imposed constraint of tying our shoes together, I've proposed we leave rates at zero permanently, and that the Fed just sell, the Treasury not sell anything longer than the 3-month bill, which is basically the same as cash. And there's no money to be made doing that or lost.
I'm going to move to Brad's question. Brad's got his hand up there. Brad, can you hear me?
I think he's trying to fix his mute.
It doesn't show that he's mute, but we'll come back to Brad.
Hey, Robert,
Yes.
let me say, okay, so number one critical was sequence. And you can see how that's been addressed answering these questions. Once you have the sequence right, these questions that used to be questions change the nature. And that's what's happened. The nature of the debate is changing in Washington. Number two, hasn't changed yet. And it's imperative that it does. And that is they've got the interest rate thing backwards. Higher rates from the Fed causes inflation. They don't fight inflation. So we've got people saying, look, if we spend more, it causes inflation, the Fed raises rates, we're in big trouble because of all the interest we're going to have to pay. Well, why would the Fed raise rates if they knew that that caused more inflation? They wouldn't. And that whole argument would go by the wayside. So I think right now it's critical for MMT proponents to understand why and how raising rates causes inflation, and why we've got to get the Fed educated so that we can get that fear mongering out of the current debate to open the door for progressive agenda, because that is holding it up. It's okay to run deficits now because rates are low and we're paying less in interest, but we got to do it now because if rates go up, they're now. Well, if the Fed's raising rates, it's going to cause inflation, which it does and has every time they've done it in the past. They think it's fighting inflation, but it's not. It's causing it.
Do you think they actually don't know this, or
They don't know this? I've talked to them.
So why are they in the position that they're in? How did
They're in a position from fixed exchange rates, gold standard, where markets determined interest rates, and you raise rates to attract reserves to prevent yourself from devaluing.
But the evidence
the price of gold,
support what they're holding.
It's all an anachronism. It's a massive anachronism.
So I'm suggesting we need to get other people appointed to the Fed who actually understand MMT. No?
Yeah, whatever it takes, because it's got to be done quickly. Because otherwise, MMT proponents they don't get on this, and they're not. They're not paying attention to this. They're going to go the way of the Keynesians, in the 70s, where suddenly they get discredited. The Fed raises rates, and they weren't warning about it. They have no answer. They're not out there saying it's backwards, and they just go quiet and they go away. I don't want that to happen. I don't want them to lose their credibility.
It would appear that, MMT's been working fairly well when you look at the bank bailouts of 15 years ago or so. All that money that the Fed put into the money supply didn't cause inflation, didn't.
Well, let me tell you why. And it's not that MMT is working well. MMT analysis is accurate, is what you're saying, has been correct. Okay, so you've got money in what's called reserve accounts. Those are your checking accounts at the Fed. Now, when you move money from checking to savings, when you buy Treasury securities, those Treasury securities are not counted in the narrow measures of money supply. They're only counted in the very broad measures, which they don't use anymore. So all the Fed has done is shift back by buying securities, doing QE, is they've shifted money from checking accounts at the Fed to savings accounts, which I started on this in 1997 and 8 when Japan started doing it. It's like, it's not going to do anything. It's not going to cause inflation. It's not going to cause the currency to go down any more than Bank of America or Citibank shifting money, offering you a return on savings to move out of your checking is going to cause any macroeconomic events. Nobody even pays attention to that because it's got nothing to do with it. And so the Fed hasn't added any money except under too narrow of a definition to be of any value. Under any normally broad definition, money supply is unchanged.
Warren, what about all this money that's just been allotted just in the last year with President Trump in Congress?
Yeah, that's fiscal spending. That does add to the money supply, net financial assets. That's what you look at, not the Fed. The Fed's not doing anything.
We're not seeing an immediate effect on inflation right now.
Right.
So doesn't that? I guess where I'm getting at is.
Let me explain why.
Don't answer it yet. I want to put
Okay.
out the big picture of, like, if we're already seeing how just having debt doesn't cause the sky to fall, okay?
That's right. That's right.
Why aren't we then moving in the direction of, paying for Medicare for all, paying for a Green New Deal, the Thrive program, whatever we want to call it?
Yeah.
Why isn't, I guess I'm frustrated that things don't happen.
Yeah, I know.
Once you figure out, how things work.
Yeah. Then those questions are not applicable. So in the economy, personal income is way up because of all the fiscal transfers that you talked about, all the trillions of dollars. But spending is not up. Consumption is down. Why? It's because people spend income, which is up. People also borrow to spend. Car payments, house payments, all kinds of borrowing, credit card payments to go to the movies or whatever. Okay. Borrowing to spend is way down. So that component of spending is down. Now, why is it down? Is it down because people just don't feel like spending because of COVID? Or is it down because when you're out of work, you don't qualify to borrow money anymore? I'm not sure. Okay, I haven't done the surveys. I don't have any way to do that. But if borrowing to spend was at the same level it was at pre-COVID, then we would have a spending issue now where spending would be exploding from all this public sector deficit spending. So the public sector deficit spending has been replacing the drop in private sector deficit spending, new investment, corporate deficit spending. It's not there. Okay, so it's been replacing that. And that stuff has faded away. So you have to watch that very carefully to make sure you don't, overcook things.
So what do you suggest should be happening right now?
Right now, all kinds of things. I don't know if you want to save that.
Give me your top three.
Yeah. So Medicare for all immediately, which is a deflationary event, puts 5 billion more people out of work. So we have to address that problem, but we need to redeploy those people into a whole lot of other things, such as public education. So we need free public education. We need all kinds of public health initiatives. We need infrastructure, but we don't need, I have an interesting thought on that. We don't want infrastructure that, we just can go faster, high-speed rail and all of these things. There's got to, look, speed, we used to say, speed costs money. How fast do you want to go? You go twice as fast, you can be burning up 4 times the energy. So we've got to reassess the importance of all this speed that we're thinking it's fun and it's convenient. And, a Tesla can go 0 to 60 in 2 seconds, but is that the direction we want to go? I mean, you burn a lot of energy going 0 to 60 that fast. Is that what we want to do? Is that why we want to build power plants and everything else to facilitate this type of thing? And so in terms of what we're doing, I mean, every aspect of what we're doing needs to be re-examined in this light as to what are we doing on the resource level? What are we doing on, human development level? What are we doing for preschools? What are we doing for personal attention for children who have issues? What are we doing for, not only just healthcare that's there, but actually, getting it to people and doing it effectively? How about medical research? Why haven't we just written a check for $100 billion for cancer research to qualifying universities? What's stopping us from doing that? Cancer is still, a serious problem. Once we know that we can do this, as long as the researchers are available, as long as the test tubes are available and the X-ray machines, whatever these guys need, now we can go flat out and make serious progress, against all these diseases, which I think have a much higher priority than a lot of other things we're talking about.
I'm going to switch to some of the people that have been waiting to ask questions.
Yeah, sorry.
Susan, you're up.
Actually, I've already spoken, so I'm going to hand it off to Brad. I see there's other people that want to ask questions as well, so I want to give them a chance to speak.
Alrighty.
So I'll hand it off to Brad, and then there's a couple. I think Alex is after that, and then Gonzo.
We'll come back to you. Brad, are you there?
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay, great. I could hear you all along, but apparently my mic was muted. I didn't realize it. Anyways, Warren, my question is about the infrastructure bill that's currently being proposed by Mr. Biden, and all the talk around how you're going to pay for it and all that baloney. And I was wondering how that fits in with your description of Medicare for all, and it would actually require a tax cut. And I was wondering if that would apply also to what is out there anyways for the infrastructure plan.
Yeah, well-
Even the bigger one.
So the way I'd say it is the infrastructure plan would pay for the Medicare for all. Because Medicare for all saves the country about $500 billion a year in real expense, and that those real resources could be redirected towards infrastructure, which would be a whole lot more than President Biden's talking about. First of all, the package is tiny, over 8 years.
Absolutely.
They're going to fix a bridge somewhere. And I don't think they've addressed the issue of how you actually fix this infrastructure, because we saw it under Obama's administration. We've seen it at state and local levels and at FEMA levels. New Orleans is still trying to get through the process of getting, their restorations going. How many years has that been? And the whole federal process of getting these things funded and done and contracted and bid and everything else drags on. This could drag on for 20 years. We never see it. So we've got a bureaucratic issue that, to be polite, that we've got to address to be able to effectively get these things done. You can't just sign a note and appropriate money and expect infrastructure to actually happen, at the magnitude and the level we can afford and we'd like it to happen. So federal government's got a lot of work to do on its
It would take
interface.
2 years just to figure out what we have to do,
Yeah.
at least.
Yeah. So one of my proposals for infrastructure was, some of it's federal, but some of it just give grants to the state governments to get it done. And the only thing they owe the federal government is an accounting at the end of the year of what they've done to show their voters when they run for reelection. So you got $10 billion, $100 billion, California federal infrastructure money. What did you do? At the end of the year, they have to account for it, show it to their voters to decide if that's how they want it done. Now, there are some projects that need to be coordinated nationally. I understand that.
I'm going to move to Alex with the next question.
So I became aware of your work partly through Jonas Varoufakis, and in particular what you say about sequence really helped me understand when he was trying to set up the parallel payment system using tax credits to transition to retransition to the drachma. And he strikes me as very keyed into the MMT lens and this sort of stuff. And I find some of his proposals interesting and fresh. And my feeling is like with a universal basic income is that you're not particularly in favor of that because of the moral hazard. And I'm not sure if you're familiar with his take on it, where he calls it a universal dividend. And the idea is we all contribute to the capital of Google when we use Google search engines. So we should all, get a dividend from it. And I know you were saying about the corporate tax structure can be regressive. So I was wondering if you had any opinions on how, if it's still regressive when it's sort of a redistributive mechanism rather than a funding mechanism.
Yeah. So what it is functionally is a tax cut, right? So just a different sign. So let's go back to Africa, where the British put a tax on everybody's hut. They all showed up to work and they paid them to grow coffee, and then they paid the tax. Okay. So what would have happened if they said, we feel sorry for all these people going to work, they shouldn't have to do that. How about if we just give them all enough money to pay the tax? Well, that's fine, but then there's nobody showing up to grow coffee. All right. So if the government has a tax on everybody's house, and then it gives us basic income enough to pay the tax, so we don't have to have the anxiety of the tax is introduced, which is probably, a level of anxiety unmatched of anything else in the history of humanity. And it's ongoing and it's pervasive and it affects art, it affects everything. It's just like it's a really sinister intrusion on the psyche. But anyway, let's just give them all enough money so they don't have to pay it, so they can pay their tax. Well, now the government can't use its otherwise worthless currency to provision itself. It's now a worthless currency again. There's nobody showing up to be a soldier or public health worker who wants that money in return. So if you do it for anything less than that, fine, it'll still function. So I'm not categorically against it, but you have to understand you're playing with fire, and it does make up for a lot of the complex, the regressivity and complexity in our tax codes to exempt people from having to pay a tax. It's one way to do it. But if you don't understand what it is, a couple of years can go by and it's working, and there's a fallacy of composition. Well, let's just give everybody a little bit more, and bang, you go over the edge and the whole system collapses. So that's why I say it's playing with fire. You're threatening the government's ability to provision itself, which is the whole point of the exercise. So as long as you're aware of that, and it's targeted in such a way that it's not, let's say, truly universal, or but again, and then what it's supposed to accomplish, I can come up with other ways that are not dangerous to accomplish what you're trying to accomplish without threatening the government's ability to provision itself. So I'm not categorically against it. It's playing with fire, and there are better ways to do the same thing, in my opinion.
All righty, we're going to go with a question from Gonzo.
Yes. Hello, Warren. Hello, everyone.
Oh.
My question is, if deficit spending by the government adds net financial assets, adds money to the economy, what happens when the private sector starts borrowing again and creating money via banks? How do we eliminate those net financial assets that we added before in order to prevent inflation from occurring?
Yeah. So what you're talking about is the private sector credit expansion will fuel spending. It's always about spending. It's not about the money being out there. If you borrow money and just put it in your savings account and don't do anything with it, it doesn't affect anything. It's when you spend it. So an increase in private sector borrowing to spend can drive up prices. And that's why prices tend to go up during times of expansion, because the private sector does that. There's more mortgages, price of homes go up, so there's more mortgage borrowing. It's all pro-cyclical. Private sector is necessarily pro-cyclical, which is what you're talking about. And so as that happens, you can look at it and you can say, okay, we'll at 5 or 6% inflation, it's okay. If you don't like it, don't forget, inflation doesn't get started and then runs away and turns into Zimbabwe. That's done through deliberate policy that has to contribute to that inflation every year, or else it's going to stop. It takes a lot of work to keep an inflation going. The government has to pay higher and higher prices, which is the other thing that comes out of sequence. We have a simple public monopoly. The price level is a function of prices paid by government. No other economic school of thought has that knowledge. They all look at it as inflation expectations. They have no understanding of the source of the price level. We do, right down to the penny, really. It's prices paid by government. They're the monopolist. Monopolists are price setter. It's economics micro 101. Okay, it takes 15 minutes. It's very simple. All right, so do you want to allow price increases, figuring it's going to bring out supply? You're talking about a relative value story, et cetera. The thing is, I've been watching markets for 50 years now, and I've never seen an inflation caused by that phenomenon. I've seen that happen many times, and usually the cycle ends for some other reason, but it never got to the point where you had an inflation of any consequence, 3, 4, 5%, and then it backs off because we had such a strong countercyclical tax code that the deficit actually came down, as the private sector credit expanded, the government deficit shrinks even faster. So in 1997, 98, 99, we had private sector credit growing at 7% a year of GDP. It was an incredible growth. And the government deficit came down just as fast and went into 3% surplus because of the aggressive counter-cyclicality of the tax code. So we already have what are called automatic stabilizers in place that tend to be more aggressive than the growth of private sector credit, and actually work to cause the economy to stall and go into reverse. That's what reversed the expansion in 2000. That's what it reversed in 2007. The deficit got down to 1% of GDP during that real estate boom, because of the boom. And you can go through each cycle and you can show how the automatic stabilizers are so aggressive that they brought a good economy down by taking, the growth of that net money supply just evaporated. So Short answer, we already have automatic stabilizers in place, which I think are too aggressive. And they will right now automatically offset those private sector credit increases.
All right,
Credit expansion.
we have a question from Holly.
Yes, hi, thank you. And thank you also, Mr. Mosler, for your presentation. Now, I am, not an economist at all, but every time you talk about taxing as the government's need to provision itself, what pops into my head is the Magna Carta. And, that goes back a long way. I mean, if we're going to talk about taxation as the need of the government to provision itself, it seems as if, as I've understood modern monetary theory, taxation is more grounded in the ability of the government to enforce collection of money. So that, in other words, you mentioned this very quickly when you talked about the I'll burn your house down.
Yes.
That's empire, right? Domestically, I really don't know too much about how that works its way out. How the coercive effect of government to collect taxes has worked. Other than militaristically or through some form of violence or another. Now, that is also traditionally, those are national boundaries, nationally bounded areas where governments work. And I'd like you to speak to that. As I first encountered modern monetary theory, it was tied up with something called sovereign currency. And sovereign currency is, as I understood it, maybe I'm wrong, nationally bounded. Certain currencies, right, are not tied to the dollar, are not sovereign currencies. The dollar is a sovereign currency and so on. Now, in that context, perhaps you could talk about the need for political boundaries in order for any of this to work. For national boundaries. And could you also then speak to what is now being suggested as a global taxation of corporations like Google, and how this would affect your theories if it were possible to institute, or if it was done, global taxing entities? What sort of government would be provisioned from that?
Okay, so what's the first question? I'm sorry. You strung several things together.
All right, let's just go to national boundaries. How needed are political boundaries in order for as an unspoken prior first step to any of this to work?
Okay, so it all begins with taxing authority, and so you have to be able to put on tax liabilities that are enforceable. Otherwise, if nobody has to pay the tax, they're not going to work to. They're not going to want that currency. There's not going to be any demand for the tax credit without a tax. A tax credit only has value if there's a tax. The dollar is simply a tax credit. It has value to people because it extinguishes a tax liability, and they're willing to work to get it. If there was no recourse, if they didn't pay, then they're not going to work to get it, and you're back where you started from. So it's absolutely dependent on coercion, the IRS's ability to enforce the tax code. Without that, there's nothing. It's a non-starter.
Okay. So in other words, I think what you were talking about before is if you don't pay your taxes, you lose your house.
Yeah,
that's the economy. That is, that's the economy enforcing the ability of the government to tax it, right?
That's the IRS coming in and taking your house away and putting it up for sale to pay your taxes. That's the IRS taking your car. The IRS, attach your paycheck. The IRS will put you in jail for tax fraud. I mean, it's the most brutal agency we have.
Well, I would tell you it was the bank that would come and repossess your house. Am I wrong?
For not paying taxes? No, that's for not paying a loan to the bank. The IRS will do that they'll put a tax lien on anything for not paying your taxes. For even suspecting that you might not have paid your tax. First thing they do is put a lien on all your property, then they take you to court to enforce it. But I don't know if you've ever been audited, but they're the worst. I mean, and they seem to find people who enjoy doing it, which makes it that much worse. They are the individuals in there act like, you're the enemy of the state because of this. So
do you need sovereign governments? nations?
Well, I
nation
don't use the
states?
word sovereign government because the definition is a kind of a moving target. It was originally started, I think, by Randy Ray for the idea that you have to have a floating exchange rate rather than a fixed exchange rate. And then it became, I don't know, no foreign debt or something. But I do well without using that term. I've never found the need to use that term. But anybody with taxing authority can do it. We've got the University of Missouri with Kansas City put a tax on their students. They have taxing authority to create the buckaroo, their student currency, and they said to your students, you have to pay us a tax of 20 buckaroos every semester, or else you're not going to get your grades. And to earn buckaroos, you have to do community service. Okay, and so the hospital, work at the hospital for an hour, the police department volunteer, and you'll get 1 buckaroo per hour. And I created that currency there, and then at Denison College with Fado, and then Franklin University with Andrea Terzi, Professor Terzi. And all these 3 student currencies are perfectly functioning currencies like the dollar or the yen, because the schools have the ability to enforce this tax, this collection. Now, are they sovereign currencies? I guess, I don't know. But using that word I don't think adds anything. Taxing authority is what it's all about. You can call it whatever you want.
What's a global taxing authority? What's a global tax?
Okay, so I'm not sure. I think what the United States wants to do is tax its corporations that are headquartered in the U.S. if they earn money overseas. So if Apple has a branch in Ireland or something, they want to be able to tax that in the U.S.
Actually, I think it's gone a step beyond that, but I'll thank you.
Yeah, well, maybe it has, but it's all like, if you think of just the compliance costs for all this stuff, the tax code, that's a highly regressive tax, on corporations, on individuals, that could be, replaced with a progressive tax with no compliance costs. I talked to a friend of mine, a professor at the University of Chicago, mainstream economist. He thinks the compliance costs for our tax codes, our transactions tax codes, sales tax, income tax, are 15% of GDP. That's all the human endeavor that's tied up in this stuff, from record keeping to compliance, to going to school to learn it, to courts, to all this overseas stuff that's set up, and all the energy that's burned and all the computer time and everything else. It just completely goes away if we don't try and do this. So yeah, it's disturbing to me that they just keep adding to this monster of unproductive human endeavor that directly takes away from a real standard of living. These are brilliant people that could go out and cure cancer, who are instead they're tax lawyers or something like that, or they're accountants setting up these intricate schemes. Instead of having cures for cancer, we've got the best tax schemes in the world. It's like this is like, I don't know. It bothers me. I think you can tell. So
We got a few more questions.
Yeah.
I'm sorry to interrupt. We have a few more questions, and then we're going to wrap it up here. Next is Susan Eldridge.
Yeah, so just to kind of extend on the tax thing a little bit. So I understand that apparently FDR put the Social Security in the Social Security tax because he knew, according to the Luther Gulick memo, he understood that it wasn't necessarily like financially, and Luther Gulick was trying to say, we really don't need to do this. It's not going to be inflationary, et cetera. And he said, yeah, I get it, but I'm doing this for a political reason. I want people to feel like they have, skin in the game, so to speak, and it'll be harder for future generations to take it away. And I've kind of seen it as a double-edged sword. I mean, on the one hand, yes, people feel like I've paid into this, don't take it away, but it hasn't really stopped anyone from trying to take it away and, chip away at it and try to destroy it and say that we don't have enough money to keep this program going. People paying taxes. So, I guess I get you thinking about tax policy and if we don't need, should we get rid of FICA? Should we get rid of the Social Security and the Medicare tax and just do like a straight progressive tax based on ability to pay the tax, since we all have to pay a tax, because that's, it's required that we pay taxes. So we can't just get rid of federal taxation. But if we did it strictly on a progressive taxation, would that be a better approach? Or is it better to make people think that they're paying into it so that they'll fight more for the program?
I had this discussion with Dean Baker. Do you know who he is?
Yeah, I've heard of him.
That was 3 or 4 years ago at his CPR, whatever his institute is, Center for Economic Policy. And he's progressive. and it's called a useful fiction. And I have a whole chapter on Social Security and how it's how it's a fiction, and it shouldn't. And I thought my position is, as an academic, as an educator, which a lot of MMT proponents are, then you should just tell it like it is. And it's either you believe in an informed electorate or you don't, right? And I believe in an informed electorate. And Dean didn't. He thought that if that ever happened, then the program would be at risk, and the only way to save the program is to try and continue this useful fiction and not go the way of MMT. And so he was never MMT proponent because he didn't trust that knowledge in the hands of voters or individuals or anybody else. So that's kind of a philosophical point. Either you believe in an informed electorate or you don't. I do. And once you do, then you come up with a whole different narrative and a whole different set of proposals and different conclusions as to what you want in those proposals.
Okay, thank you. Michael, you had a question?
I do, thank you. I actually just want to return really quickly to your analysis on what was going on kind of at the same time, at the time that Italy was defaulting on its obligations. And my understanding is that at the time you believe that Italy somehow or another would come out of it at least with less damage than was originally anticipated. And I'm interested to see how you would compare this to what ended up occurring in Argentina after 2001, particularly because if my understanding is correct, that the national or the federal reserves in Argentina were corralled, well, actually quite literally, that's what they called it, corralito, but they were corralled and then brought to those who were holding their debts. And that's been a drama that's played out after for some years since then. So if I may just kind of briefly, what played out differently in Italy than in Argentina? And does that have any relationship to the role that the state is able to play in terms of being an active role, we'll say, in the individual citizen's life? I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Well, what year Italy are you talking about? 1992 or 2012?
1992. So the time
right.
That I believe you were most interested economically there.
Right. So, well, no, I was there in 2012 also.
Understood.
Yeah. So, back then they had their own floating exchange rate, same as Argentina. They didn't have the foreign debt issue. Okay, so that just wasn't something they had to be concerned about. So, Argentina had the dollar bonds,
right,
and which is a whole interesting situation. I did a whole presentation on that to a group down there not too long ago, maybe a year ago, and I could send you a copy of it.
I would love to. Yeah, I would love to take a look at that. Thank you.
Yeah. Okay. So, and what their strategy could be going forward, but even with all those issues of foreign debt, because the peso is their currency, they spend first before taxes can be paid, et cetera. They can always hire the unemployed. They can always facilitate the private sector hiring the unemployed. They can always support full employment policy. And so I've got a paper called Exchange Rate Policy and Full Employment on my website. It's only 3 or 4 pages. It's moslereconomics.com. So check that out first. Okay. And then, it's warren.mosler@gmail.com. You can always contact me.
Okay. I thank you. Yeah, thank you much.
And then,
I appreciate it.
I'll try and get you that presentation in Argentina. But, it's got some issues, but basically, for the most part, that debt is non-recourse. There's not a lot those bondholders can do. And, there are certain things they can do. Like I remember the president's plane was impounded or something like that. But that's kind of minor stuff around the edges. Yeah.
If I may, and this is what concerns me, is because there have been papers published recently from the Financial Times within the last week or two, discussing the way in which Chinese debt traps, so to speak, or the Chinese Communist Party has really taken some inroads into South America, pointing particularly at Argentina, pointing particularly at Bolivia. And my sense of things as they head toward a presidential election the next week or so, Peru will probably be looking at similar things. This is what concerns me is the way in which debt leverage is utilized against nation states.
Yes,
and how you might speak to those. Yeah.
Yeah, the nations don't understand their options. They get rewarded for playing along with the IMF, for playing along with China. They get personally rewarded. The biggest problem down there is, an intense level of corruption. If you Google Venezuela corruption or something, you'll see some guy in Miami got I don't know how many zillion bolivars sold, from the banking system through insiders, sold them for $2 billion, bought property in Miami. That's one guy for $2 billion. The actual number is going to be staggering. And they're just using the political system to bleed the wealth off and to get foreign exchange for the conspirators, let's call them, whoever they are.
Yeah.
And it's a large web of people, and it includes people involved in the state-owned enterprises. And it causes currency depreciation. They do it through currency depreciation. They sell their local currency to get foreign exchange. They really don't care how far down it goes or how high the inflation is, as long as they're getting their dollars or their yen or whatever, euro, out of the transaction into their accounts. And they all participate, and it's been going on for a long time, 50 years or something. I mean, maybe 1,000 years, I don't know. But it's when you get these jobs in government, it's like you won the lottery. Now it's your turn to do this to everybody else. That's how they all see it. And
it's indeed very unique with Argentina specifically. And I'll not bore the audience with the particulars of it, but as somebody who spent a good deal of time living and working there, and has come to know the country pretty intimately.
Do I have 3 minutes to relay a story of Argentina?
You have my time, but absolutely. Go ahead.
So I go down. Daniel did the Jefe's program, Dave Don, and then he left the labor ministry, and then the next guy in took his budget and did something else with it. So it was still sort of there, but going away. And they were a couple of years later, they're faced with labor shortages. He thought it'd be a good idea to restart this program. So he invites me down to talk to people in Buenos Aires, and I go down with Jan Kregel. So the three of us go down. And one of the meetings is at a progressive institute, which had, 10 central bankers in it or something, 20 of them in there, and we're all wearing suits. And it was a very, middle-aged group. And I started explaining why they should reinstate this program of offering a job to anybody who wants one, in order to make that population attractive to the private sector, so they wouldn't have labor shortages that could grow their economy. So one of them asked me a question. He says, well, how much are you going to pay these people? So I said, well, what's the minimum wage? And they said, like 600 pesos a month or something, which is $200 or something. And I said, well, maybe half that, 300 pesos, because in 2001, 2002, it was only 100, and the people there were willing to work rather than, they were all asked, would you like to work and get paid, or would you rather stay home and just get the money? And every one of them wanted to go to work to show what they could do and hopefully transition to the private sector. So anyway, I said maybe 300 pesos a month. So he says to me, quote, well, if we give those people that much money, some of them might eat some meat. Okay. So Daniel turned bright red. Jan starts rolling his eyes, like he was United Nations Development Economist, really good, one of the, probably the best in the world. He's like nodding his head, like I warned you about these. This is a progressive institute. So, I'm a little irreverent, and I don't miss a beat. I just say to him, well, look, if the purpose of your current institutional arrangements is to make sure a substantial part of your population isn't ever going to eat any meat, you're already doing a good job. You really don't need to hear the rest of this presentation. So he turns around and addresses the other group in Spanish for a couple of minutes, turns around and comes back to me, and he says, well, we've decided it might be okay if they ate some meat, so we'd like to hear the rest of the presentation. So that's who you're dealing with down there.
Fair, yeah,
it was shameless. The whole thing was shameless.
Yeah, the project of clientelism is something endemic to Argentine democracy, and is a very, very sensitive subject, and in fact is an animating presence in the local economy as well as political economy. And
if you have a dinner down there, and there's a level 13 government employee sitting next to a level 14, they won't talk to each other. Their class structure down there, just under the surface, from what I found, this was 15 years ago, was, to call it rigid was an understatement. It was severe, intense.
Yeah, Well, nonetheless, I'll leave it as such. But I thank you very much
Yeah,
for your
okay,
contribution.
sure.
I appreciate it. Thank you.
Warren, if you don't mind, we have like 3 more questions, then we're going to wrap it up.
Sure, take your time.
Teddy, you had a question? We're not hearing you though, Teddy. Is your mic on? It looks like it is. So, and worst comes to worst, if you want to put your question in chat, we can go that route.
I know Teddy.
No?
Now,
Hey, there they are. Hi, Emily, Teddy.
Oh, is it better now? Okay, thanks, Warren. The talk has been fascinating. So I'll keep my question brief because there's a few more. So my question might be a bit more political than economic, but I think it's pretty practical. And basically, if we think about historically, the government has not been, the paragon of fiscal responsibility. It's like, I feel like every week you read about another scandal, government contracts going to like, cronies, spending millions of dollars on like refrigerators or things like that. So MMT gives us this license to say that the government can spend whatever it needs to give us the things that we need. So how do we stop that from basically turning into the government can now use all these real resources and then squander them away to greed and corruption?
Yeah, it's a work in progress for sure. And I've got ideas on like how to take the money out of politics, which is where I think it all starts. You probably heard it, but it's my 60-40 proposal where you can donate any amount of money you want, but 40% goes to the opposition. And I think something like, and it doesn't have to be 60-40. I think something like that, goes a long way to neutralizing the effect of money in politics. And it doesn't cost anything for the government and it's easily enforceable. And there are questions like, well, what if you have 3 parties or 4 parties? But the states already have these situations. They've already figured it out. Whatever you do is much better than what we have today, where the one candidate gets the entire donation. And you've probably seen a list of my proposals on my website. But, look, we don't have enough bank regulators to handle the banks that we have. And what's the answer? We've had presidents who have cut down on bank regulators. I'm sure that was due to bank lobbying, so that they aren't watched as closely, right? So, in terms of banking, I've always said, look, the first thing you do is you put the regulation in place, make sure you can regulate it, and then you slowly open the spigot to let them do it, to make sure that you can properly control it, because they're dangerous animals. And now we've got this move for public banking, as if that's some kind of panacea. Now, I understand all the problems with private banking, but public banking has its own massive set of problems, and everything gets politicized. You don't get a home mortgage loan unless you have a Trump sign in your house or something like that. And we saw that happen in all the European public banks for years. I remember Paribas and Santander and all those are just riddled with, scandals and insiders things in public banks. And we still have that happening in emerging markets where the public banks have massive scandal. Now, I'm not saying it's worse than the private bank. I'm just saying they're both got to be controlled before you turn them on. And so we have all these proposals to do things without getting controls in place first to see how, for the process that's going to follow. Same thing with the infrastructure program. Do we have controls in place first that, will control this kind of thing, and at the same time facilitate immediate, deployment of the funds and the resources? I don't think we do. It seems to be, the politics come first as to, this is what we passed for you or whatever. And they want to get that out there, have the headlines, check the ratings and whatnot, and then the rest, maybe it happens and maybe it doesn't.
Okay. Alex, you had a question?
Yeah, so I was listening to one of your interviews the other day, and you were critical of the Obama administration for having a lot of exporters on advising. And there was a line that stuck with me. It said they shouldn't even have a seat at the table, and it's because their interests are directly opposed to national interest. And I suppose this is because their interest is push down the price of production, and exports are a real cost. So why would you want more of a real cost in a sense?
Yeah, their buyers are non-residents.
Right.
Those are,
And then the other day you were critical of the announcement of talks for SDRs in poorer countries, and you said it's a gift to the exporters, and I imagine that's because if you're giving them currency, they're going to buy US exports, and I never really made that connection before, because previously when I'd heard of SDRs, it was in Europe for the financial crisis. So I was wondering, one, what do you think are the appropriate uses of SDRs? And two, are there any other pernicious gifts to exporters that I might not be so aware of? Because generally exporters are praised when you read the newspaper because they make jobs. And
I've said Marx talked about capitalists, but what I'm saying is the exporters are Marxist capitalists that he was talking about, because the domestic industry wants to see enough domestic demand to sell their product. The exporter doesn't want any domestic demand, so he can hire cheap labor. He likes to see high unemployment and everything else. So it's counter to the interests of the country. SDRs were set up to provide exchange foreign exchange reserves to countries during the period of fixed exchange rates. And that was the whole IMF thing, was to facilitate smooth workings of this system they set up. And so we don't have the fixed exchange rate anymore. So the whole idea went by the wayside, and then they kind of reinvented themselves instead of just going away like they should have, because it was an institution made for a different piece of legislation that's gone. So now we still have this institution, so they somehow got to reinvent themselves as lending to countries that are in trouble in general, for whatever reason that is. I guess including Greece, which was complete nonsense, to lend Greece euros that they got from the European Central Bank. They could have done that directly. They didn't need the IMF. That was just a political, I don't know, smokescreen or something. But so what they're trying to do here is raise SDRs to provide foreign exchange, because the US would buy SDRs with dollars, and those dollars would go to countries that would then have dollar reserves to use to support their own currencies. Well, why do they support their own currencies? Well, that's to allow insiders to sell those currencies, like I was talking about for Venezuela, but they're all doing it, to all these emerging market countries that have issues with corruption in the banking system. And that's where the dollars come from that go to the insiders selling their local currency. And so they're supporting the currency to let these people out and let them cash in, and then the debt gets socialized, right, by more IMF programs, which are highlighted by what we call austerity, creating high unemployment to somehow increase your wealth. This makes no sense, right? Anyway, so I just categorically against right now, funding these IMF initiatives that are suspect, on the surface, and the more you dig into them, the more suspect they get.
All right, we're going to wrap it up, Mr. Mosler. I appreciate all the time and effort you've given to this presentation. A lot of food for thought. Kind of want you to leave us with some words of inspiration on how we could move forward in this MMT world. What advice would you give the activists that are among you here?
Okay, so the good news is we are moving forward. You wouldn't have been here 5 years ago asking me anything. So somehow we've gotten from there to here. It's taken, it used to be just me, and then there were 2 or 3 of us, and then it was 4, and then 8, and then 16, and it's been growing geometrically that way, pretty much by word of mouth. And it's been a grassroots movement to understand that the sequence is backwards, hopefully to understand the interest rate policy backwards, but largely on this sequence backwards. Now, there've been a lot of grassroots movements in the history of the world, for labor, for women's rights, for all kinds of things. I don't think there's ever been one that's built continuously for 30 years to correct the sequence of understanding in central bank accounting and operations. But here it is, and here you all are, promoting this. And so I think right now it's an unstoppable force, but it just requires an enormous effort. And I think once you understand it, it's so outrageous and you'd never go backwards. Once you understand the government's not going to run out of money, you don't change your mind 3 years later and say, you know what, change my mind, I think it will. So I think you're all self-motivated, enormously self-motivated, and there are now millions of you, and I think there's no stopping you. So I'll leave it at that. It's taken on a life of its own, there's all kinds of offshoots coming up with things like sovereign currencies and whatnot. None of it's bad or anything, but it's all, taken on a life of its own, and it's going in a lot of different directions. We've got a whole group going in the legal direction. They've done a lot of good work, and totally independently. And so, and the academics have taken it to where the mainstream now has adopted it. A lot of them are saying, yeah, we knew this all the time. And then you see quotes of them saying the US is going to turn into Greece if we don't do something about the debt 10 years ago. But, whatever, you're part of an unstoppable wave coming on, and it's not going backwards. And it's just whether it's going to happen tomorrow or 6 months from now or a year or two from now, but it's been growing geometrically, and which means it's past the tipping point. It's taking over, and I'm thankful to all of you. I'm thankful for you being on this presentation, and look forward to seeing what you all do next.
Thank you.
Yeah.
All righty.
Thank you, Warren, and thank you, Robert. This was great. I'm looking forward to more of these. I hope we need to keep getting this word out to people.
Yes, very good.
So important. So important.
Absolutely.
All right. Thank you, Susan.
Good
All right,
night.
guys. Good night, everybody.
Good night.
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 That was
Night.
very interesting.